She had never flown before, never even stepped inside an airport until that rainy evening when she clutched her tattered purse like it was her last possession and stepped into Karachi's crowded international terminal, heart pounding with both fear and hope. Zara had just turned 21 and she had no home, no money, no direction. All she had was a torn boarding pass her cousin had booked last minute and a heavy heart after being thrown out by her stepmother, who had always treated her like baggage ever since her father passed away 3 years ago. She had worked part-time jobs, cleaned people's homes, folded clothes in garment shops, and even served tea at dingy offices just to survive, but life had always felt like something that belonged to someone else, someone richer, someone luckier. She looked around the airport, overwhelmed by the shiny walls, the soft music, the smell of expensive perfume mixed with coffee. Everything looked too clean, too polished, too far from the life she had been forced to live. As she walked nervously toward the baggage belt at the Lahore airport, her hands shook with uncertainty and exhaustion. She had no idea where to go or how to claim her suitcase. She barely remembered what it looked like, and honestly, it didn't matter much because it only had 2 worn-out outfits in her late father's old wristwatch, which no longer worked, when she saw a black suitcase that looked just like hers with a blue ribbon tied to the handle. She grabbed it without thinking. Just relieved that the ordeal of traveling was finally over, she dragged the suitcase out of the airport, barely noticing its weight or wheels that rolled too smoothly compared to her battered bag. She stepped out into the chilly night, unaware that someone was watching her from a tinted luxury car, someone who had been waiting for that very suitcase for hours, someone whose life was about to collide with hers in a way neither of them could have predicted. O'Hill was a name known only in business circles, a young tech CEO who had made headlines after selling his first company at 27, now 31. He was handsome, sharp, and entirely uninterested in love or relationships, having learned the hard way that people loved his money more than his soul. He had flown in for a confidential merger meeting, and the only thing he carried with him besides his phone was that black suitcase which held confidential documents, prototypes, and the last letter his late sister had written before passing away last year. She had been his heart, his only family, and he kept her words with him like armor. So when he saw through the CCTV feed that a girl in an oversized sweater had taken his suitcase, he rushed out of the terminal and ordered his driver to follow her. The car trailed her silently through the city streets as she took a local rickshaw and finally got off in a dimly lit street near a rundown hostel. She paid the driver with coins and entered the building holding the suitcase like it held the world. Hill waited a few minutes and then walked in, asking the receptionist if someone had just checked in with a black suitcase. The man nodded and pointed to the stairs without much interest. Zara had no idea that the suitcase she had placed beside her bunk bed was not hers until she opened it and found a neatly folded designer suit, a leather folder with gold trimming, and a photo of a smiling young woman hugging a man who looked oddly familiar. Her heart sank as she realized this wasn't her bag, and before she could even think, someone knocked on her door. She panicked and opened it, only to find the man from the photo standing before her in a crisp white shirt soaked slightly from the rain, his expression unreadable, his eyes intense. She stammered an apology, holding the suitcase out like a guilty child. But he didn't yell, didn't accuse. Instead, he walked in calmly, looked around the sparse room, and asked in a soft voice why she had taken it. She told him everything in a rush, that it was a mistake, that she had nothing of value, that she didn't even own a phone to check the tag. He listened silently, then opened the suitcase, took out a small black envelope, and sighed in relief when he found the documents intact. Then he looked at her, and for the first time in years, he saw someone who wasn't pretending, who wasn't playing a role. She didn't ask him who he was, or why the suitcase mattered. She just looked ashamed, tired, and very, very real. He surprised himself by asking her name, and when she said Zara, he nodded and said thank you before turning to leave. But something stopped him at the door. He turned back, looked at her trembling form, and asked if she had eaten. She hadn't, and he knew it. She hadn't had a proper meal in days. He offered to take her to dinner, not out of pity, but something else, something he couldn't name, and before she could say no, he was already walking down the hallway. She followed hesitantly, and they walked to a small roadside cafe. He ordered food she had never tasted before, and they sat in silence. Broken only by the clinking of cutlery, he watched her eat like it was her last meal, her eyes lighting up just a little, her shoulders dropping their weight. When he asked about her life, she told him the truth, no filters, no drama. Just the plain hard truth of being unwanted, invisible, and lost. And when she spoke about her father, her voice, cracked, and Ahil felt something stir in his chest that hadn't moved in years. After dinner, he dropped her back and told her if she ever needed help, she could come to his office. He scribbled an address on a napkin and left. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but something about that night, something about his silence, his calm eyes, his unexpected kindness lingered with her for days. She kept the napkin tucked under her pillow like a strange kind of hope. Meanwhile, Ahil couldn't stop thinking about the girl who had no reason to be honest yet chose to be the girl, who had touched his world not with beauty or charm but with truth and something in him. Something long buried began to shift. The next few days passed. Slowly, Zara applied for jobs, got rejected, walked miles under the sun, and always returned to that dingy hostel with aching feet and an emptier stomach one evening after being turned away. Yet again she took out the napkin and stared at the address. Her fingers trembled as she folded it and decided to go. The office was in a high-rise tower downtown, surrounded by glass and steel. Zara felt like a speck of dust in a world made of diamonds, but she walked in anyway, asking for Ahil, the receptionist. Looked surprised and said he was in a meeting, but Zara could wait. She waited 2 hours, her stomach twisting with fear. When Ahil finally walked out and saw her, his expression changed from surprise to something else, something warm. He took her aside and asked if everything was okay. She nodded and said she just wanted to return the ribbon that had been on the suitcase, the one she had tied to her own bag so long ago, and somehow that silly blue ribbon made him smile, a real smile, not the corporate kind, not the forced public kind, but the kind that touched his eyes. He asked if she was looking for work, and when she hesitated, he said he needed a temporary assistant, someone who could organize files, help with errands, nothing fancy. And without thinking, she said yes. She started the next day, and though she was quiet, unsure of the buttons on the set computer, and often tripped over her own shoes, she was sincere and determined, and never lied. And slowly Ahil began to look forward to coming to work, not for the meetings or the money, but for the girl who brought him coffee with shaking hands and who always said good morning like she meant it. She made mistakes, spilled water, dropped a folder once, almost cried in the elevator. But every time she apologized, he would smile and say it's okay, and every time he smiled, something in her broken world healed. Just a little. Neither of them realized when their conversations became longer, when Zara started packing lunch for two, or when Ahil began noticing the way her eyes searched the sky during lunch breaks, as if asking something only she understood, but everyone around him noticed. His managers whispered, his friends teased, and his rivals speculated how the CEO was always laughing around a nobody girl from nowhere. But Ahil didn't care. For the first time in years, he was listening to music in the car, watching old movies, laughing at silly jokes, and Zara, for the first time in her life, was learning what it meant to be seen, to be valued, to be loved, not with words but with gentle kindness and silent protection. And as the days turned to weeks, something unspoken began to grow between them, like a story that hadn't been written yet, but was waiting to be told. It was a Thursday afternoon when Zara came to the office wearing a yellow scarf her father had gifted her years ago, and Ahil paused mid-sentence during a meeting just to glance at her as she walked in with files pressed against her chest and a nervous smile on her face, the same smile she gave every time she entered a room too expensive for her presence. But Ahil didn't see her clothes or her past. He saw the way she listened when people spoke, the way she stood up for the office cleaning lady who was scolded unjustly, the way she spent her lunch breaks feeding biscuits to stray dogs outside the building. And every day his admiration turned into something deeper, something quieter, something powerful. He couldn't name one. Evening, after most of the staff had left and the golden light of sunset spilled across the glass walls, Zara knocked softly on Ahil's cabin door, her fingers trembling, her lips pressed together. She walked in holding an envelope and placed it on his desk. Inside was her resignation. She had found a job somewhere else, stable position with better pay and regular hours, and she thought it would be best to move on before the boundaries of professionalism became blurred. She couldn't explain why she was crying as she said it, maybe because for the first time in her life, she was leaving something good, something safe, something that didn't hurt, and it terrified her. Ahil sat still for a moment, then stood up, walked around his desk, and looked at her eyes, not blinking, and said, "No." She looked up confused, and he repeated himself softly, "No, you can't leave, not like this." And when she asked why, his voice cracked for the first time in years, "Because I finally found someone who makes me feel like I'm not alone anymore, because I look forward to seeing you every single day. Because this office doesn't feel like a building when you're in it, it feels like home, and because I think I'm falling in love with you," Zara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth and tears welled up in her eyes. Not out of fear or confusion, but because she had waited her whole life to hear words like that, to be loved not for beauty or background, but for just being her. Ahil stepped closer. Slowly, gently, as if afraid she might vanish, he told her he didn't care about her past or where she came from. He only cared about where they could go together, and for the first time in a long time, Zara felt safe. She didn't know what love looked like. She had only read about it in novels or watched it from afar, but in that moment, as his hand held hers and their hearts beat like shy strangers meeting for the first time, she knew this was it. They didn't announce it, they didn't change their relationship status or tell the world. They just kept showing up for each other every day in small, quiet ways. Ahil started walking her home in the evenings, even when his meetings ran late. Zara started leaving notes on his desk with reminders and hand-drawn smiley faces. They began having breakfast together before work, sometimes in silence, sometimes with laughter, and one day when Ahil was down with fever, Zara stayed by his side for 2 nights straight, feeding him soup and wiping his forehead, whispering stories until he slept when his eyes opened and saw her sleeping in the chair beside him with her head on the edge of his bed. He knew he couldn't let her go. Ever the world around them began to change. Investors noticed Ahil's calm joy. Employees whispered that he seemed more human now, more kind, and Zara started dressing a little brighter, standing a little taller, and laughing a little louder. One evening, while they were walking home under a light drizzle, Ahil stopped in front of an old bookstore, looked at her, and asked if she'd ever dreamed of traveling. She shook her head and said dreams were too expensive. He smiled and said, "What if we made them affordable together?" She looked at him puzzled, and he opened a tiny box in his hand. Inside was not a ring, but a key, a simple silver key, and he said, "This is to my home and my heart and everything. I own you. Don't have to say yes now or ever, but I want you to know there's a place in my life that belongs to you, only you." She took the key with trembling hands and couldn't stop the tears that fell silently that night. They sat by the window in his apartment, watching the rain as he made her hot chocolate and played her favorite song, and everything felt surreal to a girl who had once slept on floors and counted coins. The next few months felt like magic. They traveled to a nearby town where Zara saw the ocean for the first time and ran barefoot into the waves, while Ahil watched her with a heart so full he thought it might burst. They danced on a quiet rooftop under fairy lights, baked a burnt cake together, and painted old furniture. Just for fun. Their love wasn't loud or dramatic. It was soft, gentle, like a song that plays in the background but never stops. One afternoon, as they were sipping chai by a street vendor, a familiar voice called out. Zara turned and froze. It was her stepmother, the same woman who had thrown her out, who had never called or searched or apologized. She stood there looking shocked at Zara's new life and asked if she was doing well. Zara simply nodded and said, "Yes, very well, thank you," and turned away holding Ahil's hand tight, and in that moment she felt something powerful. She wasn't that abandoned girl anymore. She was loved, valued, and seen. A month later, Ahil proposed, not with a grand speech or a public event, but in the quiet garden where Zara used to sit alone. He knelt with a simple ring and said, "I don't want a perfect life, I want a real one with you." And she said yes, not with words, but by hugging him so tightly it said everything. And as they married in a small ceremony surrounded by people who mattered and none who didn't, Zara looked in the mirror and saw not the girl who had picked the wrong suitcase that day at the airport, but a woman who had found the right heart by pure accident or maybe destiny, Because sometimes life doesn't give you what you asked for, it gives you what you never knew you needed. And as they drove away into their new life together, laughter filling the air and fingers intertwined, the girl, who was once forgotten by her family, became the center of someone's universe, and the man who once guarded his heart like a fortress found peace in the arms of the one who never meant to steal his suitcase, but ended up stealing his heart. Instead, had found the right heart by pure accident, or maybe destiny, because sometimes life doesn't give you what you ask for, it gives you what you never knew you needed. And as they drove away into their new life together, laughter filling the air and fingers intertwined, the girl, who was once forgotten by her family, became the center of someone's universe, and the man who once guarded his heart like a fortress found peace in the arms of the one who never meant to steal his suitcase, but ended up stealing his heart instead.